This is a Bergen Film Club podcast.
Like an old movie removed from the frame, I am floating and looking for someone to blame. Won't you project me on the walls of your heart? I'm waiting for the real thing to start.
Hello, welcome to The Real Thing. I am your host, Joe Lawrence, and this is episode 1 of season 4 of The Real Thing. How freaking exciting is that? It has been a good, long, hot minute since I recorded this podcast, but I'm back. Summer summered, spring sprang, and now it is very rainy in Bergen, and it is time for autumn, which means, really, that it's time for Bergen Film Club's fall semester. Let's go. We have a brilliant collection of films this autumn, and it's going to be great. We're going to talk about a lot of them on the podcast, and as always, some special episodes, and I'm very excited. It seems very promising. Season 4 seems so adult. I think I can confidently say that the podcast has grown up now. It's over a year old. I am a year older than I was when I started this now. Recently had my birthday. Happy birthday, me. And yeah, but what is this podcast? So Bergen Film Club is an independent cinema in Bergen, Norway, that aims to show films that deserve to be shown, that need a light shone upon them, whether that's directly seeking out films that need to be shown, like female directors, non-binary directors, trying to give a voice to those who need it, and just bring brilliant film, a great curated program to the masses of Bergen and beyond. The podcast, The Real Thing, essentially functions as a extension of the program. So I'm going to talk about the films that are included in the program, which you can go check out on bergenfilmclub.no. And yeah, I'm going to be doing that. But welcome to the podcast if it's your first time listening. I hope that this is going to be a good introduction to the podcast, and I hope that you enjoy it and that you go back and listen to some of our older episodes because they're all great. There is a whole 36 episodes to listen to or something. So, but right now we are starting off with a bang and a crash and a skirt and some Australians. Bergen Film Club had its premiere opening last week for the autumn semester, for the autumn program, with the movie Mad Max Fury Road, which is the film that we're going to be talking about today. I had not seen this film because it just completely passed me by. I was 2015, I was 17, and this was before I was into movies, I think. And Mad Max I was like, that's a boy film and I'm not interested because it has cars in it. But how wrong I was at the time. It turns out I love cars in this movie particularly. It was a very exciting film, great premiere for the film club, and yeah, exciting things to come. Yeah, not much to say otherwise, apart from that we should just get into the freaking episode. So we're starting off talking on the whole new season of The Real Thing, Mad Max Fury Road from 2015, directed by George Miller. Mad Max Fury Road, or as it has been called, A Western on Wheels, is a 2015 Australian post-apocalyptic action film co-written, co-produced and directed by George Miller, who collaborated with Brendan McCarthy, who is a well-recognised and known comic writer, TV writer and concept production designer on shows and films such as SNL, Coneheads, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the film and the movie of The Borrowers, and Nicola Turris, who is an Australian actor and writer, TV writer, and features actually in the original Mad Max movie in 1979. This is indeed the fourth installment in the Mad Max franchise. The film was nominated for 10 awards at the 80th Academy Awards, winning 6 and received numerous other accolades including Best Film from the National Board Review, and was also named one of the top 10 films of 2015 by the American Film Institute. Retrospectively, it has been called one of the greatest action films of all time and one of the best films of the 2010s. The film series follows the character Max, who starts the series as a police officer in a near-future Australia that sits on the edge of collapse due to war, critical resource shortage, and ecocide. As society devolves, gangsters brutally murder Max's family. He then becomes a vagabond, drifting through the wasteland alone, periodically encountering remnants of civilization who often rope him into their own machinations and problems. His desire for apathy and a life alone is often challenged by his need to help others, with him often intervening just in time to save the day before leaving once again. After some time, he becomes folklore alongside the character Imperator Furiosa, who we'll talk about later. George Miller redefined the post-apocalyptic genre with his Mad Max series. Yet, after making 3 sequentially larger films following a lukewarm reception of the trilogy's concluding film, Beyond the Thunderdome, in 1985, Miller put the brakes on his franchise for some years, stating, quote, "Whenever the idea of another came up, I thought there wasn't much more I could do with it," end quote. However, in 1988, when crossing the road in Los Angeles, the idea of a film centering around one constant chase could work came to mind. The yet-to-be-made Fury Road spent years of production hell for several reasons, namely scheduling issues, insurance, money, the weather, 9/11, the Iraq War, and Babe the Pig in the City. Just before we get into the main part of the episode, I just want to say the main sources that I used in this episode. Of course, Wikipedia. The Mad Max Fury Road Wikipedia page. Heavily cited from this New York Times article by Kyle Buchanan called Mad Max Fury Road, The Oral History of a Modern Action Classic, in which he interviewed the whole cast and everything and got their insights into the filmmaking process. There's also the book, Blood, Sweat and Chrome, The Wild and True Story of Mad Max by Kyle Buchanan. Also, a Guardian article by Peter Bradshaw, which also heavily cites the New York Times article, and many more which you can read in the show notes. Okay, so let's get into the production, or namely the pre-production of Mad Max Fury Road. Mad Max Fury Road was stuck in what is often referred to as production hell, a term mentioned pretty often on the podcast, especially with a lot of the bigger films that we talk about. We spoke about it on the Dune episode, for example. Following Beyond Thunderdome, Miller got the idea for a film containing a singular chase which focuses only violent characters fighting not over oil, but this time over human beings. From the Collider article, Miller discussed the difficulty in writing a movie like this in a traditional way, since he opted to outline in storyboards, which were almost comic-like. He said that the obvious way to have done this was with pictures, as it was easier to get all of the ideas out and put it into words later. Working with 5 storyboard artists, they ended up with around 3,500 panels, which is actually almost equivalent to the number of shots in the film. Laturis and McCarthy, who I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, helped coalesce the storyboards into a script, and these two also designed many of the characters and the vehicles included in the film. The previous 3 films had featured the then relatively unknown Mel Gibson as the eponymous Max. The film, back around 2000 or 2001, was slated for pre-production with 20th Century Fox. In this time, Gibson was still really interested in reprising his role in this new movie, and Gibson was around 45 at the time, with filming set to begin in the Australian outback, the location of the previous 3 installments of Mad Max. However, the film met its first major hurdle around this time also. The studios were already getting cold feet about George Miller following the kind of lukewarm reception of his 1990s film Babe, Pig in the City. However, the first real issue to come was 9/11. Miller says this is when, quote, everything changed in the hopeful new project. It was impossible to insure or transport the vehicles to be included in the film. The fallout of the attacks, despite the obvious, led to the collapse of the American dollar against the Australian dollar, which caused the budget of the film to, quote, balloon. In the New York Times article, production designer Colin Gibson said, quote, I was in Namibia in 2003 when I got the call to stop spending money. I don't know whether the studio decided to reroute the money back to the Iraq War, or if it was the email I got from Mel Gibson's wife asking me how many Muslims there may or may not be in Namibia, and therefore how interested she may or may not be in the whole family coming to visit, end quote. Before they'd had the chance to reconvene and set plans in action, Miller and his team had already committed to the new Happy Feet movie. They spent the next 4 years working hard on The Happy Feet, a movie that's themes are not so wildly different from that of Mad Max. But following the success of Happy Feet and convincing the studio to reinvest in Fury Road, Miller returned to pre-production without Mel Gibson, however. It's not really worth touching on Mel Gibson's, quote, turbulence, as George Miller very dotingly puts it, because we all know that he is racist, anti-Semitic, and a bad guy. In Time Out magazine, Miller kind of skirted the issue when asked about it, rather reasoning Gibson's absence from the movie to be due to his age, that this wasn't, quote, the movie Unforgiven. In the New York Times article, producer Doug Mitchell says, quote, Miller pivoted to directing the animated film Happy Feet, and when it proved to be a box office success for Warner Bros., he was able to, like I said, convince the studio to take on Fury Road. Still, his longtime leading man, Mel Gibson, was now in his 50s and considered a Hollywood pariah. Miller and Mitchell decided to search for a new Max, end quote. And thus begun their hunt for a new leading man. Many not so well-known at the time actors, but well-known now, were considered, such as the very unknown Armie Hammer, Jeremy Renner, Michael Fassbender, Joel Kinnaman, Heath Ledger, Eric Bana, and Eminem, who said that he wouldn't be a part of the film unless they could film it in the US. So that didn't work out. So casting was so far along at this point, so now we're kind of getting it through the 2000s on the timeline, that Zoe Kravitz, who plays one of the 5 quote wives in Fury Road, said that she had done chemistry test readings with Jeremy Renner, which was around 2009. With the intention of someone to play Max in the same way that James Bond is replaced. This is how George Miller kind of went about reframing the character of Max. This seemed to retroactively fit very well into the Mad Max lore, as Max is known as an everyman, a wanderer, folklore hero predating, quote, local history. Miller was drawn to Tom Hardy, and I should say that this is a pre-inception Tom Hardy, as Max, claiming him to be, quote, the most evident of all suggested, drawing a parallel between Hardy and Gibson upon their first meeting with the director. So now, equipped with a new leading man, it came to cast the leading female role, which was a slightly less convoluted story than the recasting of Max. An original pitch in the role of Furiosa was Sigourney Weaver, who was indeed suggested by Gibson himself, Mel Gibson, around 2000. So following all that happened with Gibson and everything else that happened, like the Iraq War, this idea was dropped. But despite this, George Miller claims that he'd always been intent on casting Charlize Theron. Around that time, names such as Uma Thurman weren't considered, but Miller was even considering her around the first period of pre-production. And at the time, Theron's agent had claimed that Charlize wasn't interested, to which she responded over a decade later in the New York Times article, quote, "No one ever told me." When she was asked about the casting of the film, she said, quote, "I grew up on the Mad Max movies. They're very popular in South Africa. I remember being 12 and my dad letting me watch it with him, so I was like, oh yeah, I want to be in Mad Max movies? Are you kidding me?" End quote. Furiosa is heralded as one of Theron's most definitive roles, which is a huge claim because she has so many. The original pitch for Furiosa's design was something more ethereal and something Theron claimed worried her at the time, and that the character was coming off a little Barbarella-y. She had this like beautiful long hair, and it was kind of like Aboriginal Australian kind of like markings on her face. The original character had been designed by someone else, but along with Charlize, costume designer Jenny Beavan, Jenny Beavan, OBE, who is a multiple award winner and nominee for her work on films such as Cruella in 2021, Fury Road, obviously, and many more. She and Charlize pitched changes to Miller. And Charlize said, quote, "I don't know how she's getting by in the mechanics room with all this hair. I think we need to shave my head, and she needs to be more androgynous, a more grounded character. You know, he trusted me with so much that it kind of makes me emotional. In that sense, I feel like I let him down," end quote. But I think kind of updating and kind of like getting a more realistic idea of what Furiosa's character looks like, that made a lot of sense. I don't think it would have made sense to have her look like one of the wives in the film. She needed to look distinct because she is a distinct character. So, in 2009/2010, production was relatively ready to go. There had been a consideration to make the film an animated feature at some point, but Miller ultimately had decided to shoot a live-action film since many of the previous sets and various vehicles were already available from the previous failed filming in the early 2000s. Miller additionally announced his intention to make a second film straight after Fury Road, Mad Max Furiosa. Equipped with his mostly brand new cast and team, Miller was hopeful for Fury Road again. The sets were built, 200 vehicles ready, all stunts rehearsed, fake roads built, Australian shooting was set to begin. Quote, "And then the rains came in an unprecedented manner," end quote. During the final stages of pre-production, the weather pattern in Australia, Queensland, shifted dramatically in a, quote, once in a century, end quote, type of change. The barren desert slowly became a beautiful smattering of wildflowers, which is not exactly post-apocalyptic chic. Many of the cast worried that this would be the end of all of their endeavours, along with some of the crew, but Miller was determined to continue. They waited a year to see if it would dry up and if the flowers would die back, but they didn't. But Fury Road was a movie that was always going to be made. It insisted on it. The whole operation then moved to Namibia, where it really never rains. This move changed the perspective of many of the cast, now that they were really in it, far removed from society, practically living and breathing the post-apocalyptic world. In July 2012, over a year since the first raindrops in Australia, filming finally began. There's some really interesting stuff to read about the filming experience of the actors, so I really suggest that you go and have a look through the Mad Max Fury Road Oral History of a Modern Action Classic by Kyle Buchanan, that New York Times article. Also check out his book. It has some very dishy details. Dishy is the wrong word. It's like on-set tensions, basically, because everyone was just kind of stuck in Namibia whilst filming it, and it was said by a lot of the actors that they couldn't even like imagine that this film was ever going to be what it became to be, because it just felt so... I don't know if you could say that the film is grassroots because it has like an enormous budget, but nonetheless, that's how they felt, that the idea of it eventually becoming this like huge conglomerate of awards and the whole industry that it became was hard to imagine when they were just all stuck together in Namibia making this film isolated all alone. So coming to the post-production, the film was edited by Margaret Sixel, who won the Academy Award for the Best Film Editing and a BAFTA for editing too. She is a frequent collaborator of George Miller, who is also her husband. Sixel had never worked on an action movie, yet this is exactly the reason, Miller claims, that she was chosen. That if the film was edited by a normal guy, quote, it would look like every other action movie, end quote. Sixel had around 480 hours of footage to edit, which alone took her 3 months to watch. And that was, just to stress the belaboring point, that's even before she edited the movie. She had to watch 480 hours of footage, which took months and months and months. Cinematographer John Seale, who Miller kind of pulled back out of retirement for this film, stated that 50 to about 60% of the film runs below the traditional frame rate of a film of 24 frames per second, and that this is due to Miller slowing down scenes so what was happening could be better understood, and that also this was done in the opposite, that if there were scenes that he felt like needed to kind of like be hurried along, he sped it up, and that made the film kind of incredible in this way because almost every shot has been kind of like manually manipulated. The sound designer Mark Mancini stated that he viewed the war rig that Furiosa and Max are driving across the wasteland together. He viewed this as kind of an allegory for Moby Dick, with Immortan Joe, the baddie in the film, playing the role of Captain Ahab, and as such the mechanical truck sounds of the rig were layered with whale calls to provide a more animal-like quality, and when the tank is pierced with harpoons, milk sprays out, and the sounds of whales breathing from their blowholes were incorporated into this. And for the final design of the war rig, the only sounds used were slowed down bear growls to symbolize the death of a truck as a living creature. So the film is so layered with so much thought and intent, and in a way it feels like a comic book come to life, the way that everything is set up. So awesome. I'm gonna just talk quickly about kind of what I thought about the film, because this is my podcast and I can do what I want. I really liked it. It was awesome. It was interesting talking to some people about hearing that initially at the time that people were surprised that like Max's role is like relatively small in the film, kind of like he's the character that we follow into the film obviously, but then Furiosa is the character that is kind of leading she's driving she's driving the film literally. But Charlize Theron is incredible. She, sometimes I feel like with big action films, nuance doesn't always come very naturally because maybe it doesn't feel like it's always needed. In a lot of action films that I have seen, I guess nuance is what I feel like is lacking. It's just kind of like blam blam blam, the end, which is fine. That's nice sometimes, but it was great to see in this film that there's a lot of emotion and a lot of thought and a lot of care into the characters put in, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was so exciting. Like, what an exciting movie. Seeing it in the cinema was so great. I'm so glad that the first time I got to see it was in a cinema, because I was on the edge of my seat the whole movie, for real. I've heard like I've like generally known the movie, but not like deeply. Just known like the What a Lovely Day thing by Nicholas Hoult and The Witness Me. But The Witness Me had a much bigger role than I was expecting, and I kind of enjoyed it. I thought that it was kind of dumb when it first started, but I thought like their kind of like dedication to one guy through like brainwashing. I liked seeing that kind of like unravel over time. And that the themes of a lot of George Miller's films, if it's strange to kind of compare all of the Mad Max films to Babe and Happy Feet, for example. But the core of all of his films, I think you could say, are these, like, no matter what the situation is, connection and family and kind of like love and care, despite the odds, is like what drives every person through a bad situation, and kind of like realizing and understanding that interpersonal connection is the only thing that like makes us real and can get us through the day and win the day. And that happens in Happy Feet, and that happens in Mad Max. It's nice that he has these kind of like recurring themes of hopefulness in extremely horrible situations, and like that he is bringing a lot of environmentalism and a lot of climate centered kind of rubric into his films so consistently, which is kind of just what I wanted to touch at the end of the episode, because we're coming to the end now. I like to try and touch on kind of like a topic that's included in the film that can be expanded on a little bit and kind of tie stuff together. And I think there's something nice to talk about here is this notion, this genre of climate fiction, which is something that as many may not know, I have studied science, biology, and conservation my entire academic career, and it's something that I work on and I think about all the time. So seeing it fictionalized is very interesting. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about climate fiction. There's often abbreviated as cli-fi, and it's this genre that's exploring impact of climate change and environmental crises through speculative and imaginative narratives. So it's basically taking this kind of like post-apocalyptic narrative and framing it through environmentalism and climate change. These stories, set in dystopian futures, alternative realities, depict profound effects of global warming, natural disasters, and ecological collapse on humanity and the planet, exactly like in Mad Max, by weaving together science, often real science, politics, and personal experiences. Cli-fi challenges the reader to confront the potential, or the reader. I say reader because a lot of the research I was doing for it was a lot very book based, but anyone, like the consumer, to confront the potential consequences of mankind's current environmental trajectory. I say that it serves both as like a cautionary tale and as like a call to action that's inspiring you to reflect on the urgent need for sustainable solutions to our rapidly changing world. It is a topic that I would love to get into more, and maybe in a future episode it's something that I can touch on again or only focus on. But I think this idea of climate fiction is something that isn't necessarily so new, because I think that a lot of the post-apocalyptic stuff has its kind of like basis in like, what if climate change did get really bad, like The Day After Tomorrow, for example, for a huge Hollywood film that basically is talking about climate change. It kind of, I think climate change often, because, you know, we don't experience it real time. Well, we do experience it real time, but not the huge effects that will eventually happen if we don't make any changes. It kind of affronts us with this image of what could happen. So say in Mad Max, they live in a desert, these horrible arid regions where water is such a scarcity and oil is a scarcity, and then human life becomes this commodity that can be used and sold and bartered. But that is a society that is a product of the society that we live in now. We live in a society, bro, that the way that we're living now could in fact create this kind of situation. So something that Mad Max briefly touches on actually in its intro, with a couple of the like news article things clipped over the intro, is talking about these water wars, and that there were these water wars in the 20th century in America, in California, and these other places as well, that like this scarcity of water and scarcity of materials will, you know, society can't effectively exist without the stuff that it exists on now. Margaret Atwood has a really great essay that she wrote, called "It's Not Climate Change, It's Everything Change," where she presents 3 different options for how the world will exist without oil. That we have the choice to find alternative, we run out, or a third terrible option, and they're all pretty bad. But there are these like very notable works, like Margaret Atwood's entire bookography, filmography. What's a bookography? Yeah, but something like that, like all her work, and you know, like J.G. Ballard wrote The Drowned World, books like that. The Road by Cormac McCarthy, Oryx and Crake, Margaret Atwood. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. The History of Bees by Maya Lund, and of course Dune. Couldn't go without mentioning Dune by Frank Herbert, who was a huge environmentalist, and the origin of the story of Dune is in Oregon. I think that Frank Herbert was observing that to stop the shifting sand dunes in Portland, they planted all this grass, and he observed it from like a helicopter and wanted to publish about it. But then that's how Dune came to be. And that, in fact, on the first ever Earth Day, Frank Herbert spoke to over 30,000 people in Philadelphia, telling them, quote, "I don't want to be in the position of telling my grandchildren, quote, I'm sorry there's no more Earth left for you. We've used it all up," end quote. Like, saying that in the 1970s is like so, you know, like this notion of environmentalism, of climate change, has always been real. Always since back then. And resource scarcity, and not preserving the world, but creating a world that is able to exist for future generations. But that's where I think climate fiction is like, it shows us how awful it could be, and that it, like I said, is presenting us with how we need to change. But in works like Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, and like Mad Max, it does show the kind of like the tenacity of the human spirit, that like through connection and through understanding each other is like really how we survive. And there's so much to get into climate fiction, and I was thinking today especially about like there's some music even that like Wise Blood's most recent albums, Titanic Rising and In the Darkness Hearts Aglow. She is Natalie Merring is a huge proponent of environmentalism, and especially like marine life protection, which is something that a lot of people can kind of attest to. She's singing about these kind of like notions about like, what is our world now, and what is it to be human, and basically destroy the home that we live in. There's a very great poem by Margaret Atwood called The Moment, which I won't read, but I recommend that you do read. But I will leave the whole thing, or just kind of sum up what I just spoke about. But this very good quote by Margaret Atwood from The Handmaid's Tale. "Nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub, you'd be boiled to death before you knew it." End quote. So forgive me my little environmental tangent at the end of that. The reality is, and I really have to stress that essay that Margaret Atwood wrote, "It's not climate change, it's everything change," because it really, you know, we are one missing commodity away from Mad Max. And environmentalism and climate change and conservation is a scary, depressing thing to think about. And as someone who did a 4-year bachelor in conservation, and just got increasingly more depressed at the notion that there is no hope. There is hope, because we have research and we have science and we have each other, and we have to believe in our community to make a change. And we can do it and make Mad Max stay fiction. That is, I'm asking you, episode 1, season 4 of the podcast, please do not make Mad Max real. I am very, very carsick and I wouldn't like it. Well, thank you very much for listening. It's been so fun. Oh my god, I love podcasting. We have some great episodes coming, and go follow the Instagram at The Real Thing Pod. Go follow the Bergen Film Club Instagram as well at Bergen Film Club. Come to the film club if you're in Bergen. Be a volunteer. Come say hi. Thank you so much for listening. I've been Joe Lawrence. This has been The Real Thing. Goodbye.